In the bustling city of Port Harcourt lived a man named Mr. Smith. He wasn't always the wealthy businessman the town knew him to be. In his early years, Mr. Smith had struggled to make ends meet, barely scraping by with his modest business that seemed to yield more problems than profits. During those hard times, Mr. Smith had a wife who stood by him. A woman who knew what it meant to hold on to hope when the future seemed uncertain. Together, they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Nelly. Nelly was barely 2 years old when things started to change for Mr. Smith. His business, once on the verge of collapse, suddenly took a turn for the better. Contracts came in, clients grew, and money flowed where it once trickled. It was everything Mr. Smith had dreamed of, but with prosperity came a change in his heart. As his fortunes rose, so did his distance from the woman who had supported him through the darkest days. It was as though the wealth had wiped away memories of struggle, and with it, the bond he had shared with Nelly's mother. He made a decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. He left. Just like that, without warning, Mr. Smith walked away from the family he had built, and chose instead to start anew. Nelly was too young to understand. All she knew was that her father no longer came home at night, and her mother's eyes grew sadder with each passing day. Mr. Smith remarried shortly after, this time to a woman he met through his growing circle of influential friends. His new wife was different, elegant and refined. Everything his previous life had lacked. To the outside world, it seemed like Mr. Smith had it all. He had wealth, a beautiful new wife, and a flourishing business. But beneath the surface, something was always missing. Nelly, his daughter from his first marriage, was the thread that still connected him to the life he had chosen to leave behind. As the years passed, Nelly grew into a striking young girl. She had inherited her mother's grace and delicate features, but there was something more. A kind of beauty that couldn't be ignored. Patricia, Mr. Smith's new wife, had a daughter of her own, Anna. Unlike Nelly, Anna was brash and loud, with an arrogance fueled by her mother's constant praise. Patricia adored Anna, pampered her with the finest clothes, tutors, and toys money could buy. To anyone looking in from the outside, it appeared that Patricia was the perfect mother. But inside their grand home, a different story unfolded. One of jealousy, bitterness, and cruelty. From the moment Nelly stepped into their home, Patricia had viewed her as a threat because Nelly's beauty and her quiet demeanor was no match at all. Anna, Patricia's daughter, of a certainty, was the apple of her mother's eye, but in her heart, Patricia knew that Anna could never match Nelly's natural beauty and grace. And so, the seeds of resentment took root, growing deeper with each passing day. Patricia began her mistreatment of Nelly subtly at first. She would make cutting remarks disguised as motherly advice. She would tell Nelly that she was too thin or that her hair wasn't quite as lovely as Anna's. She would give Nelly the plainest dresses to wear, while Anna was dressed in the finest silks and lace. Nelly felt every sting of Patricia's words, every cold look, every missed opportunity to be loved. Patricia would often send Nelly to do the household chores, while Anna was free to play or study. The once lively and joyful girl became quiet, shrinking into herself as the weight of Patricia's words and actions bore down on her. But the worst of it wasn't just Patricia's cruelty. It was that of her father, Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith himself had also begun to treat Nelly with growing disdain. When he looked at her, all he could see was a reflection of his past. Nelly was a reminder of the days when he struggled to make ends meet, when his clothes were worn, and the meals on the table were meager. She reminded him of the life he had left behind. A life he was desperate to forget. Whenever Nelly entered the room, Mr. Smith's mood darkened. Her presence dragged him back to a time he hated, a time when he was just a poor man, struggling to climb the ladder of success. He resented Nelly, not for who she was, but for what she represented. Every time Nelly asked for his attention or affection, he pushed her away. "You're just like your mother," he'd say, his voice bitter. In his heart, the twisted notion took root that distancing himself from Nelly meant distancing himself from his own painful past. And so, instead of the love a father should have for his daughter, Mr. Smith greeted Nelly with coldness, criticism, and neglect. The once happy little girl, full of life and innocence, found herself growing up in a household where love was withheld, and her presence was resented. Her heart ached, not just for the father she barely knew anymore, but for the family she never truly had. One day, Mr. Smith found himself in need of a huge amount of money. He had his eye on a lucrative contract that could elevate his business even further, but he needed a substantial amount of money to make it happen. Desperate and with few options, he approached an influential businessman in town, a man known for his wealth and connections, Mr. Benson. Though Mr. Smith presented his need as related to business, his true intentions were far from noble. The money wasn't just for the contract. He planned to use it to send Anna abroad for her studies, continuing to secure her future while leaving Nelly behind. When Mr. Benson heard of Mr. Smith's proposal, he was intrigued and he agreed to lend him the money, but with steep terms. Months passed, and the contract Mr. Smith had banked on fell through. His business struggled, and the repayment of Mr. Benson's loan loomed over him like a dark cloud. Desperate and out of options, Mr. Smith found himself cornered. Mr. Benson began to press him for repayment, reminding him of the heavy debt he had incurred. One evening, over a tense meeting at Mr. Benson's luxurious mansion, the influential man proposed an alternative. "If you can't repay me in cash," Mr. Benson said, his voice dripping with casual cruelty, "perhaps your daughter can work for me. She's of age, isn't she?" Mr. Smith blinked in confusion. "Anna?" "No, not Anna. The other one. Nelly," Mr. Benson said. For a moment, Mr. Smith was silent. His mind raced, and a familiar resentment bubbled up inside him. He had no intention of sending Anna, his prized daughter, into anyone's household as a servant. But Nelly? She was nothing more than a reminder of his past, a ghost of the life he despised. A twisted thought entered his mind, one that he quickly latched onto. Perhaps sending Nelly to Mr. Benson's household would rid him of that constant reminder of poverty, once and for all. When Mr. Benson saw the calculating look in Mr. Smith's eyes, he knew he had agreed to his proposal. "She can work off the debt," Mr. Benson continued, "and I'll consider the matter settled." Mr. Smith hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll send her over next week." When Mr. Smith got home, he informed Nelly of his decision. "If you want me to love you more, you will do this for me," Mr. Smith informed Nelly. Nelly thought perhaps if she does this, like her father had said, his love for her will grow. So she agreed. And just like that, Nelly's fate was sealed. Sold off by her own father, not for her benefit, but to cover up his failings and protect the future of the daughter he truly cared for. A few months later, Anna traveled abroad. Her life quickly spiraled into a haze of excess and recklessness. Late nights blended into early mornings as she drifted from one lavish party to the next. The allure of bright lights, loud music, and champagne-soaked nights consumed her. Amidst the frenzy of her carefree existence, Anna met Julian, a young man who stood out from the crowd. He wasn't like the others who flocked to her for the excitement she offered. Julian was more reserved. He didn't share her appetite for the high life. In fact, he often sat in the corner of parties, watching her with eyes that saw more than just the surface. He was thoughtful, grounded. Their connection deepened, and before long, they got closer and became friends. Now, while Anna's world was luxurious, Nelly's world was vastly different. She toiled as a maid in Mr. Benson's household, serving as payment for her father's debt incurred to send her stepsister abroad. The first year for her was grueling. Nelly was treated as nothing more than a servant, constantly belittled by the other maids. Every day, she scrubbed floors, polished silver, and served guests with the grace of someone born to endure. She worked without complaint, her hands moving with steady precision, but her heart whispered prayers in the silence of night. She prayed for deliverance, for an escape from this life of servitude she found herself in. Her faith was her only solace. The quiet conversations she had with herself and with God gave her the strength to rise each morning with purpose. She carried herself with a dignity that eventually caught Mr. Benson's eye. At first, he had barely noticed her among the other maids. But slowly, he began to see something different in Nelly. Unlike the others, she never complained, never asked for favors. She simply worked, determined, steady, as if she were preparing herself for something greater. One day, 1 year later, Mr. Benson called her into his study. Nelly's heart pounded as she stood before him, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She expected another order, perhaps more tasks piled onto her already heavy workload. But the look in Mr. Benson's eyes was different this time, measured, thoughtful. "You've worked here for some time now," he began, his voice calm. "And I've watched you. You're not like the others. You carry yourself with grace, with purpose. I believe you're meant for more. Because of this, I'm making you my chief maid, Nelly," he continued. "You've earned it. And also because of your dedication, I'm reducing the years of your service. You'll be free sooner than your father and I had agreed." Tears welled in Nelly's eyes at Mr. Benson's words, but she blinked them away. She bowed her head in gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I will continue to serve you to the best of my ability." A few days later, news soon got to Mr. Smith. When he heard that Nelly's years of servitude had been reduced, he could hardly contain his rage. How could the girl, the very reminder of his past, find favor in Mr. Benson's eyes? The news hit him like a slap in the face, reigniting his resentment towards his daughter. Nelly, the child of his impoverished beginnings, was supposed to remain beneath him, bound to the life of a lowly maid forever. And yet, here she was, winning over Mr. Benson with her grace, diligence, and humility. How could she? What did she do? In his mind, Nelly's freedom was a threat. She was supposed to be invisible, lost in the shadows of someone else's household. Her growing success was a direct insult to him, a mockery of the dark days he had left behind. His pride wouldn't let him accept that this girl, whom he had discarded, was now rising, while his favored daughter, Anna, lived recklessly abroad, far from the expectations he had set for her. The more he thought about it, the more determined Mr. Smith became. Nelly would not escape her chains. He needed to act quickly before Mr. Benson fully freed her from her duties and she returned home to remind him of when he was swimming in abject poverty. And then, as if conjured from his darkest thoughts, a plan formed. It was simple and cruel, just as he liked it. If Nelly were to become pregnant, she would be trapped forever in the world of servitude. No man of Mr. Benson's standing would allow a pregnant maid to simply walk away. She would be bound not only by her role, but by the child she carried. He thought of Adam, one of the kitchen hands at Mr. Benson's estate, a young man easily swayed by money and drink. Yes. The upcoming party in a few weeks' time at Mr. Benson's house was the perfect setting for his new plan. The plan was simple: get Nelly intoxicated at the party, follow her when she was vulnerable, and do the unthinkable, have sex with her. Mr. Smith's heart had turned stone cold towards his own daughter, his own flesh and blood, and he cared less. Nelly had done nothing to her father. Her only offense was because she was born when he had nothing, and could barely feed himself or her mother. The night of the party arrived, and Mr. Smith, with Anna by his side, entered Mr. Benson's grand estate. Anna had returned from abroad, but her transformation was far from what her father had envisioned. She reeked of the reckless lifestyle she had lived overseas, the late nights, wild parties, and careless relationships she kept. Though she appeared poised, her demeanor told a different story. Inside the house at Mr. Benson's party, laughter echoed through the halls as the wealthy guests reveled in their drinks and conversations. Nelly, ever the dutiful servant, moved gracefully among them, her simple attire doing little to hide the beauty and grace she carried. She was clearly oblivious of the plan set for her by her father. Adam watched her, his eyes filled with fear, his heart pounding as Mr. Smith's words echoed in his mind. As the evening wore on, Nelly grew tired. She sat down for a while and accepted a glass of wine given to her by Adam. She was unaware that he had already spiked it with the contents of the small vial her father had given him. After a little while, Nelly's eyelids grew heavy. She felt her steps falter, but she shook it off and focused on her duties. A few minutes later, she was called by Mr. Benson and asked to deliver something to his room. She complied even though her mind swirled in a haze. She walked in a haze into Mr. Benson's room and set down the tray, but the room spun around her. She sat on the edge of the bed to steady herself, but her head fell back and her eyes dizzy. In that instant, she saw a man walked in, reeking of alcohol. The man came close to her, pulled her into his arms and slept with her. 2 days after the party, Mr. Benson and his son, Julian, traveled. Mr. Benson needed to show him some of his business partners and have him see how to run the empire, since in a couple of years, he will be stepping down partially as CEO. Both of them spent a week and came back because Julian had to travel back abroad the following week, so they hastened up the business they traveled for. Weeks passed, and Nelly found out she was pregnant. She was shocked. Mr. Benson was shocked. All the maids were shocked, and even though she knew who the father of the child was because she had seen the man who slept with her, how can she say? Who will believe her? How could she explain what she didn't fully understand herself? The shame of it all felt like a stain that no amount of tears could wash away. Who got you pregnant? Questions often asked by Mr. Benson were always met with silence and tears from Nelly, because how can she explain it? She carried the weight of her condition in silence. When news got to her father about her pregnancy, his happiness was laced with a sense of satisfaction. His plan had worked. Finally, Nelly wouldn't have to return to his house. In his mind, this pregnancy marked the moment she'd be tethered to a new life, a new responsibility, and perhaps a new struggle that would keep her from stirring up his carefully crafted and beautiful world. One evening, Mr. Benson summoned Nelly to his study. He made it clear that while she could stay until her child was born, she would have to leave afterward and go back to her father's house. Nelly's heart sank. The place she had come to view as a sanctuary, a brief respite from her father's coldness, was slipping away. Meanwhile, across town, Anna had a secret of her own. She, too, was carrying a child. She was pregnant. She had attended Julian's welcome back party thrown for him by his father, Mr. Benson, and had been by his side all through. When she as well shared the news of her pregnancy with her father, he beamed with pride. His joy was evident, but for a different reason. He was genuinely thrilled at the thought of becoming a grandfather and bonding families with Mr. Benson. He envisioned the wealth, connection, and respect this would bring to him and his business. He was overjoyed. As the weeks passed and as Anna's and Nelly's pregnancy progressed, the home of both families buzzed with the excitement of the wedding preparations of Anna and Julian. Anna was glowing, not just from her pregnancy, but from the joy of finally marrying Julian. She floated through the preparations, selecting flowers and tasting cakes, her happiness contagious. Meanwhile, Nelly watched the preparations from the sidelines, a quiet observer in the midst of all the buzz. Her own pregnancy was progressing as well, but her feelings were a storm of confusion and uncertainty. The months slipped by, and soon enough, both Anna and Nelly gave birth. Nelly knew she had to leave Mr. Benson's house once she recovers, so she packed her things ready to leave. One night, when the house was quiet and the others had fallen asleep, Nelly left her room. Her baby wrapped in a small blanket was fast asleep on the bed. She tiptoed through the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved carefully, so as not to wake anyone up, but as she had just reached the front entrance, a familiar voice stopped her cold. "Nelly," Mr. Benson called, his tone sharp and unyielding. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed. "What do you think you're doing?" Nelly froze in her steps. "You were going to abandon your baby here, weren't you?" Mr. Benson's voice was harsh and filled with disappointment. Nelly looked down, ashamed and overwhelmed, searching for the right answer in the silence. She knew she owed him a reply, but in that moment, she had none. Mr. Benson's gaze bored into Nelly, his expression demanding answers as he stood there, arms crossed, blocking her escape. She took a shaky breath, realizing that the secret she'd buried so deeply was now clawing its way to the surface. "It was the night of the party," she began, her voice barely above a whisper but thick with tension. "You sent me on an errand to your room, remember? But somehow, I ended up in Julian's room instead because I was intoxicated. I didn't know at first. I thought I was alone." She could feel the weight of his stare, but she pushed on, her words stumbling out as if they had a life of their own. "Julian came in, drunk. He looked at me like he'd been expecting me. I didn't understand until he pushed me on the bed and had sex with me. He never questioned it. Not once. I stayed quiet every time you asked me about who got me pregnant because I saw them together afterward. I saw how happy she was, how deeply in love they were. I couldn't tear that apart. I knew I was carrying Julian's child, but I buried it, thinking it was the only way to protect myself, Anna and everyone." Nelly glanced up, searching Mr. Benson's face for any sign of understanding. "I thought that if I disappeared, if I left the baby here, then maybe it would all be over. I don't belong here, not with this secret. Living felt like the only way to set myself and everyone free." Mr. Benson stood silent for a long moment, processing Nelly's revelation. Without another word, he turned and walked down the hallway. Nelly watched him disappear, her heart pounding, knowing this was far from over. A few days later, the house was buzzing as Mr. Benson called for a meeting, pulling Julian, Mr. Smith, and Anna together in the living room. Julian, who arrived from abroad the previous night, entered with Anna by his side, a soft smile on his face, unaware of the storm about to break. But as he caught sight of Nelly, her face turned pale and tense. Mr. Benson cleared his throat, his voice steady and calm. "Nelly has something to share," he began, glancing at her. Nelly swallowed, the weight of her secret pressing down on her chest, but there was no turning back now. She met Julian's eyes, taking a shaky breath. "Julian, that night at the party, I ended up in your room by mistake. You thought I was Anna and had sex with me." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it landed like a thunderclap. Julian's face froze as her words sank in. He looked over at Anna, then back to Nelly, realization dawning in his eyes. "But you never said anything," he managed, his voice thick with disbelief. Nelly looked down, ashamed and overwhelmed. "I couldn't. I saw how happy you were with Anna. I didn't want to ruin things for you both." A heavy silence followed, but Julian's gaze stayed locked on Nelly. He took a step forward and held her hands. "Nelly," he said, "I need you to know that I never forgot that night. I thought it was Anna, yes, but afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I've tried to move on with Anna, but there was always this pull. Now I know why. It all makes sense now." The next morning after the party, I awoke and saw my bed was stained with blood. I wondered how. I knew Anna was not a virgin, but it was our first time together, so I thought I must have been rough with her. Both of us were drunk and had planned to have steamy, hot sex after the party. It all makes sense now. It was you I slept with. Anna's face was a mix of confusion and hurt, but Julian didn't look away from Nelly. I've tried to deny it, to ignore what I felt that night. But if I'm being honest, my heart has always leaned toward you from that party, Nelly. Even now, knowing everything, I can't pretend otherwise." The room stood still, suspended in the wake of Julian's confession. Everyone stared in shock. Just in that instant, the palace guard knelt down and confessed to how Anna had seduced him at the party. She had mistakenly seen him changing and admired his body, so when everyone was consumed with the music and alcohol, Anna came to him. He thought she was a guest at the party, not until he saw her with Julian and realized she was his boss's girlfriend. He said he confronted Hannah, but she threatened to blackmail him if he ever spoke about that night. "Anna was with me all through, sir," the palace guard continued. "She only came to your room when it was almost daybreak and the party had ended." Everyone looked in shock and was still digesting the confession from the palace guard when Adam fell to his knees as well and began his confession. He confessed to how Mr. Smith had told him to drug Nelly's drink and sleep with her, but he couldn't bring himself to sleep with her even though he actually spiked her drink at the party. "Nelly is a kind and humble, sweet girl. I couldn't bring myself to do it, I'm so sorry." Mr. Smith fainted at Adam's confession. Anna stood frozen in shock. Nelly fell to her knees and broke down in tears. She didn't know how deep her father's hatred for her was until that instant. Was it her fault that she was born when he was at his lowest? The days that followed, Julian did DNA tests which proved that he was the father of Nelly's child, while he wasn't the father of Anna's child. The wedding preparation was halted. Mr. Smith and his wife Patricia couldn't bear the shame when the news spread, so they sold their house and relocated to another state. Soon, they got divorced because Patricia never stopped blaming Mr. Smith for her daughter's misfortune. Anna left her baby with her father and disappeared. Julian, each passing day, loved Nelly and stood by her through her recovery stage from the trauma of her father's actions. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Thank you for joining me on the story. Please support us by subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. It won't take much of your time, but it will help us to grow.